Welcome back to the Last Step, Best Step podcast, where we dive deep on Olympic weightlifting programming, technique, and mindset. This week, we're taking a look back at my favorite programming discussions from our interviews with Max Aita, Totten, and Trent Crain. Let's dive in. What are the three biggest mistakes that you see new coaches and athletes make in their programming?
I think the biggest thing I think people make in programming overall is like not having a good like overall plan to evaluate that process. So they'll write a program and they'll run it, and then kind of like however it works, that's cool, and then they come back to it and just start from scratch again. The second thing I would say is they don't have a good sense of like how to scale the program from one level to the next. So it's like we run a program and then we just run it again and again and again, and that's what we do. And there's no real evolution of the training at all. And then the third is probably like training for the sake of what's enjoyable versus actually doing things that are beneficial, right? And so that's like a lot of like, we all max out on Friday just forever because that's what we do. There's nothing necessarily wrong about that in context, but it's like if you just do the cultural things of like we train, for weightlifting, but then we also do these things that are more just for our own personal enjoyment. You need to reconcile that and say, I do this for fun, therefore I can't be upset when I don't make progress, right? Versus actually saying, hey, the goal is progress. That means that whatever is the least wrong decision to make today, we do that.
And on that first point especially, I think that's a really great point. I think a lot of people don't actually do that, which is how do you measure the actual success of the program?
Yeah.
What are the things that you're looking for as far as the success of a program?
I mean, the first thing is before we even start it, like what's the definable, like what are we trying to achieve, right? Like what are we trying to achieve? If we can't measure the outcome, if we can't say, hey, the outcome should be X, Y, Z, then we can't know if we ever got there. So we can't train for things we can't measure. If the goal is way too broad and you're like, the goal is to be a better weightlifter, it's like, well, that's great. Like, what does that mean, right? So you have to have definable characteristics. They can be qualitative. They can be, hey, we want to move better. So you take some video before and you say, what are we doing wrong in our movement now? At the end of this, we want to see these things remediated to some degree. And that might just be a rating. You sit down and say, these snatches look like a 6 out of 10 quality-wise for these reasons. You write it down, and then 2 months later, you evaluate again. You're like, hey, those points we talked about before, they look way better now. These look like 8s out of 10s. It's simple as that. And then the second thing would be, actually like looking at the efficiency of your program. It's really common to give a program that's extremely hard. It's a huge step up in volume and intensity and just an overall much, much more aggressive program, and be like, see how great my program is? Everybody did it and they all made progress. And it's like, well, yeah, because they all increased their training output by 30%. And it's actually a much less efficient program because you might have people making a small amount of progress doing 3 days a week of training, and then they get thrown into a program that's 5 days and there's 4 really hard squat sessions and their squat goes up 40 kilos, and it's like, great, look at that. Look how good it is. It's like, well, it's just larger. So is it more efficient? Is it doing things in a better way? If not, it's just like easy to throw these huge programming increases at people and have great results, and you do that. So I think that's kind of like important to make sure you look at how efficient is the program. Are we, the number of reps, the intensity, the volumes of the things we're doing, are those just growing exponentially and that's why we're making progress? Or are we actually doing a better job of organizing training and applying it? And then 2, are we actually quantifying what we're trying to achieve with each training phase or each cycle? Like these particular numbers have to go up in these exercises, or this has to be better than it was before.
So, as far as like different phases of training, what would you say? We talk a lot about volume on our podcast. We feel like a lot of lifters miss out on volume. What are
Yeah.
you looking for in a volume phase? What are maybe some like KPI? Like, is it like a 10 rep max, or is it, what are you looking for there?
So I mean, I would look at it as like your goal should be to try to. Everybody has a finite, in my opinion. I could be totally wrong about this, but everybody has a finite capacity for for assimilating training, right? People can do a lot of training. I mean, I did an enormous amount of training, and a lot of it was unproductive. But people are going to have a sweet spot of like, let's just call it like an average weekly volume. So total number of reps measured between whatever numbers you want, 60 to 100 or 70 to 100 or whatever. But like a stable number that you can say, hey, this is the average amount of training we do in a week in a volume phase. And we train it at this sort of average intensity. Like the average weight of the barbell of all the barbell movements we do is about this number. And we try to stabilize that. Our goal is to get to a point where that's stable by continually growing the amount of volume we're doing until we see like detrimental performances from that increase. So a good example would be like when I was coaching like Alyssa Ritchie years ago. We would start at say like 200 reps in a week on average, and the goal was like, let's continue to increase this over training cycles. And we got to a point where she did 1 week that was like 450 reps in a week. And she actually had pretty poor results from that. And so we started to realize like, okay, like we need to back off. Like the sweet spot for her was somewhere in that 300 to 350 reps in a week, like in that volume phase. That was our goal from the perspective of like, we need to stabilize this number and find that out where this is at. And then as we do more training, we can't just continue to grow this number. So now what we're looking for, like you said, the KPIs, like how can we find ways to organize the training that one, addresses our technical errors, and two, allows us to slowly increase that average weight of the barbell across that phase so that overload, this overload can take place without us having to just, hey, every week add 2 kilos. So maybe that's like a clever sequencing of exercises where maybe we start the cycle with these high rep sets or high rep weeks, but we use constrained exercises where 5 triples of no hook snatch is, it's going to be 5 or 6% or 10% lighter than a regular snatch, or, more power snatches or more complexes, things that sort of artificially reduce the average weight, but can still be trained relatively hard. And then as we progress and we sequence through these exercises in the block, we might start to remove those constraints. And that does 2 things. One, it allows us to easily bring back the average weight of the bar and increase it, but at the same time, not make any real modifications to the program. It's just making it slightly easier, which allows us to get the program to become slightly harder. And then the average weight of the barbell increases. So the goal is to like, in a volume phase for me, is find stabilized training volumes and then slowly increase the work capacity by growing the volume week to week. And then as we do that and we find the volume's getting really high, we might need to reduce these constraints to make it tolerable, where the average weight comes up now because we're not doing the no hook versions. And we can slowly start to bring those things into play so that when we get to the end of the volume phase, the athlete's able to tolerate the intensity stuff much better because they have a huge work capacity, but they've also gradually increased the average weight of the bar. And so now doing a bunch of, doubles and triples at 80 and 85% is very doable.
So you're almost saying, because like in my mind, a lot of volume programs, they start with the highest volume on week 1, for instance, kind of like a set, range that coach thinks is, the good amount of volume. And then it basically tapers down throughout the entire program. The volume just comes down as the intensity goes up. But you're saying that maybe a volume phase should almost include a more ramping up of volume to finding that spot where that lifter, maybe even, this is a more individual approach, obviously, but that specific lifter, starts to struggle with the amounts of volumes they're doing. You're seeing their speeds in the squat like really decrease. You're seeing those things that they're a little too overloaded. And then taking that number that now we've reached kind of their capacity and tapering down from there while the average intensity comes up. That's basically.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like the whole point of like the reason we describe something as a volume phase, this comes back to overload. The principle of overload tells us 2 things: that training has to be more difficult than it was, more stimulative than it was, and through like reason, there must be a mechanism that we are leveraging to make more difficult. And in a volume phase, I think we can all probably guess what the answer to the mechanism of what we're trying to make more difficult, which is volume. So we're playing with the lever, the mechanism of volume in trying to gain the adaptation. In a volume phase, we're not trying to increase the exposure to maximum intensity lifts. We're trying to increase the exposure to volume. And there's multiple reasons for this. One is work capacity. We need to develop some general physical qualities like the ability to tolerate large amounts of training. Two, hypertrophy to some degree. And then three, the more volume we do, the more repetitions we do, theoretically, the more practice we get. So in that early volume phase, as we increase volume, we should be able to increase the amount of exposure to technical training we can do as we get closer to the actual intensification period. So in any phase that's volume driven, that the mechanism is volume, we should be looking to maximize those things. And there might be a proportion of each, right? In a person who's really advanced, hypertrophy might not be a super small piece, might be a really big piece. Somebody who's really new, exposure to a bunch of different exercises and a high degree of variation might be really beneficial because they need to learn and assimilate the technique in a lot of different ways.
Up next, we chat with 50-year weightlifting coach Leo Totten about the differences between old school weightlifting and modern weightlifting programming. Is there anything that you see lifters not doing these days that they should be doing? Maybe that's variations of the lift. Maybe that's certain exercises. Maybe that's certain approaches to their programming. We've talked about having a more extended GPP phase. Very important. Being a little bit more athletically competent with all movements and not just over specializing too early. But is there anything else that you think, as far as training methodologies, that you see lifters not do that you think they would be better off doing now?
Again, I'm going to show my age here. I actually competed when they still had the press. Okay, they got rid of the press. It was the press again. A lot of you might have some younger people who don't even know there was a press at the time, but there was the press, snatch, and clean and jerk, and they finally got rid of the press in 1972 after the Olympics. I was really happy because I had competed, I think, 5 years. My 10th grade was my first meet in 1967. But anyway, it was the press, snatch, and clean and jerk. I was always a really, because I taught myself this, I was more of a technician and more of a cerebral type lifter, if you will. My technique was good. My speed was good. My flexibility was good. Heck, when I snatched, my butt would touch the floor. I mean, flexibility was not an issue for me. I just needed to get stronger. So even after they got rid of the press, I knew I had to get my squats up and my snatch and clean and jerk would come up. I got that. Well, back when they still had the press, literally guys got there was the technique. It was like it wasn't a military press. It wasn't a strict press. It was a more of, they called it an Olympic press, where you could get a back bend holding the bar, and then you drive it up using a kind of like a body heave, supposedly not using any knees, but guys kind of cheated and did. And I then ended up doing almost like a standing bench press. I took a lot of upper body strength and it was turned out to be a lot of technique. Well, most guys, they got the technique down so good that they could press almost as much as they could clean and jerk. So what happened was their press was up here, their snatch was usually way down here, and then their clean and jerk was up a little higher than the press. Well, in my case, because my technique was really good, my press was here, my snatch was actually way better than my press, and then the clean and jerk was up here. So I would lose a lot of ground after the press, but then I would gain it back in the snatch. But what I find is happening now, once they get rid of the press, it seems like there's a lot more press out issues with jerks, press out issues with snatches. I think getting back to doing more of that pressing type training that we had to do way back in the day, I think that would help. Just that upper body strength, I think a lot of lifters have gotten away from. Of course, there's technique that causes that press out and the weak lockouts, I think. But I think if we'd get back more to the presses, I think that would help. And again, that's some of the GPP thing. Find out. I'm a big proponent of working your weak areas. And for me, upper body strength was an issue. And I think a lot of lifters that is, just because the press isn't around anymore. Maybe it's a low back issue. Well, take more time to do hypers. Maybe do more time to do your RDLs. Um, I think there's a basics that all coaches have to have their lifters doing, but within that base that everybody should be doing, then you got to individualize a little bit and say, okay, what are some of these weak areas we need to work on? So that's a big part of how I set up my training.
That's a great point. When we interviewed Calvin's coach, he made the exact same point. Actually, he said it very concisely. He said every lift ends with weight over your head, so you better have a strong upper body. And it makes sense. It makes a ton of sense. I mean, that's what I remember seeing all the old school lifters doing was they had massive hulking upper bodies to match their lower body strength. And now it seems like everybody's really obsessed with the squat and getting the squat numbers up. And the squat is important. Don't get me wrong on that. The pull's important too. But I feel like we left the upper body behind a little bit over the last few years, and I think that would make people a lot better weightlifters, maybe help with their press out issues and not have as many issues with that as well, and potentially also kind of save some back issues as well. If you have a strong enough upper body to handle the weights that your back and your legs are throwing overhead.
Well, I used to say, let's talk about your strengths and your weaknesses. I've changed that to say, what are your strengths and your limiting factors? Because there's probably something holding you back. Like, for instance, if, you know, for me, my clean and jerk was 80% of my back squat back in the day. Okay. And what I found is that if I got my squat up, my clean and jerk would come up as well. So, I mean, there definitely is a strength ratio there. But people have to be able to work on what they're not good at. So, like for instance, your snatch and clean and jerk, your snatch should be about 80% of your clean and jerk, right? Well, if it's 70% of your clean and jerk, that tells you what you need to work on. But you got to be disciplined enough to work on what you're not good at. And coaches have to be good motivators to make their athletes want to do that sort of thing. So if the snatch is behind that 80%, it's like 70 or 75, then what part of the snatch is holding you back? Is it the snatch? Is it the technique? Is it the speed going under the bar? Is it, and then maybe you need to work more off the high blocks from that position. Is it the overhead strength? I always say that you should be at least able to overhead squat 20 or 10% more than you plan on snatching. Well, if you can't do that, then overhead strength is your issue. Or maybe you tend to press out. Well, then do some snatch grip presses from behind, push jerks from behind. Figure out what you need to do to fix that, and then you put it all together when it comes time to do your max snatch and your max clean and jerk. I mean, it's really the same thing we do when we're teaching new people how to snatch and clean and jerk. We break it down. You show them the whole method, show them the whole movement, then we break it down into parts, and then you put it all back together again. It's the same thing with the strength issues. If you have particular strength issue that you're working on, you do that separately so you can really focus on it. And then eventually the goal is to put it back together all in one movement. It works. It's just, to me, it's not, it's not any rocket science or anything. You work on what you're not good at, what's holding you back.
And wrapping up this week's episode, we sit down with Lindenwood weightlifting coach Trent Crain about his unique training philosophy.
I'm a big fan of weakness training. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So I think what I've seen in the weightlifting world is if you're somebody that isn't good at, below knee block power snatch, people try to avoid the below knee block power snatch because it's not as impressive and they don't look as good. But what that might be doing is it might be shining some light on a hole in your game as to why we need to work that area. Now, not everything, there are certain movements that aren't as directly tied to your snatch and clean and jerk, but it might be telling you something if you are really good in these areas and you're really bad in these other areas. So we need to get the bad to catch up to the good so that you're kind of ready for the next stage. High level athletes, beginner athletes, intermediate athletes, like I said kind of earlier, everybody has something that they are working on because everybody in the sport is trying to continue their success. So if you just start avoiding the things you suck at, you're not going to keep showing the same success. So when it comes down to like the nuts and bolts of it, as far as sets and reps and phases, we have a general team phase that we're in, because typically most of our athletes are trying to be the best that they can be around university nationals time. International athletes, Grace Montgomery is one of our current athletes that just went to Junior Pan Ams and Junior Worlds. She's on a little bit different of a trajectory because those meets are a little bit more important for her career as a weightlifter than University National is. So she might be in a different phase than people that are just trying to be the best at University Nationals. But usually the people that are the best at University Nationals went through the same general phase that she is now in. So she's at a different time of the macro cycle, but also how I get her to be her best her is vastly different from anybody else. One of my sayings is, there's 1,000 ways to skin a cat. At learning on how to get them, whatever block of training I'm trying to emphasize, volume, tempo, strength, blocks, power production, jump height, isn't gonna, whatever I'm trying to emphasize during that session or that block is not gonna look the same for every athlete. And that's the part that takes a little bit to kind of dive into and kind of understand. Um, it's not a one size fits all by any means. The longer you're with me, the more knowledge and focus and targeted program to you that you will have. I'm also kind of a fan of, again, that programs are not the end all be all, but I think I have a much different approach and philosophy to weightlifting than a lot of other coaches do. Once you've been with me, you kind of learn to like do a systems check of like, where am I at in the macro cycle? What's my priority and why am I doing this movement? And you learn to assess as to where you need to be at, because my best athletes, I've talked to Cal about this a little bit, but I should be able to put snatch variation, clean and jerk, and back squat. No sets, no reps, no percentages. But my goal is for you to then to be, okay, I'm 22 weeks out of a competition. The biggest thing coach keeps telling me is I need more acceleration coming off the floor and my front rack position sucks. So these are probably the things and where I need to be at, because that's how my movements are telling me where I need to be at. And from there, we can kind of evolve that day as to what we need to work on. I don't believe in programs that say I need to squat 5x5 80%. But if you're only at 65% and you're falling apart and you look like garbage, we're not going to just blindly go to 80%. Or if you just had a late night staying up studying for a test and you come in, you're like, I am dog water. There is no ways I can do that many sets or reps or percentages. First off, I'm going to probably say, let's try and see how you look. Because everybody has those days where they come in, they're like, I'm going to have a terrible day, and you wind up having one of the best days of your life. But if you get to that point and your body is not allowing you to do what the program says, I am the furthest from the coach that says the program says this, you have to do this.
Right.
Because
it's just pointless.
it is. I mean, we're not machines, we're organisms. Like if there's too much stress that we can't handle, there's no reason to just blindly push towards that, because that's the plan. So there's a lot of push and pull within the weight room. And I say this a lot too, but to be able to go up and do heavier weight, like, you have to earn it. Like there's something about weightlifting that if you're not ready for it, it won't allow you to do it. And the worst thing you can do is just like beat your head against the wall because you want to snatch 100. If you're not snatching 100, there's probably more stuff we need to work way back here that's going to get you to 100 the right way. And I think those are the things that I preach differently than some other coaches that may not have the experience that I have.
What are some things that you think you've noticed seem different about Trent's approach to programming compared to what other people are doing?
Yeah, RPE is a big one. We use a technical model of RPE. that really has to do with how many aspects of your movement are breaking down as a result of adding more weight. And typically, RPE 7 is usually the lightest week of the programming. And that looks like kind of the heaviest weight you can do without anything breaking down. RPE 8's one thing breaking down. RPE 9 is two or more things breaking down. You probably can't add much more weight after an RPE 9 set as well. That's one aspect that I don't think I've seen anywhere else. Um, most people do percentage work for snatch and clean and jerk and back squats. It's very common to see powerlifters do RPE for their main movements, but they use more of an RIR kind of RPE scale where RPE 8 is 2 reps in the tank and RPE 9 is 1 rep in the tank. So it's not quite the same. Honestly, I'd say like a big focus at Lindenwood. Most other coaches are businesses. Most other coaches do not have the luxury of getting a kid for 4 years where they can develop them long term. They want to get wins for that kid right now. They're a lot, maybe, in general terms, a little more short sighted about the goals of that kid. We see this in youth and junior athletes quite a bit. And that is one big thing. The long-term perspective, setting you up to be a really good weightlifter after your Lindenwood years, not just during them. And that does reflect in the programming. Trent might receive criticism from other coaches for not having us do total days year round, or even more than just a couple months out of the year. Where, in my opinion, that is the best way to get you the best at snatch and clean and jerk in that short term. But is it the best 3 years down the line? Maybe if you put more focus into your accessories, during that phase, into your strength movements during that phase, you might be better off in the future. So that's a big way I see our programming differ from, the handful of other programs and coaching philosophies that I've been exposed to.
I think, and I literally just wrote down a lot of kind of what he said, but like, I, my best weightlifters, it's the long term perspective. And I think a lot of coaches try to get back to snatch and clean and jerk singles as fast as possible because they're wanting more chances to arrive at a top number. So in 6 weeks, if I can get you to singles faster, you're going to have more chance to then improve those singles. My perspective is the polar opposite of that. My perspective is I'm big on foundation, and I think a lot of people come in and even high level athletes forget the base layer of foundation. As to the stronger your foundation is, the taller your pyramid can be. That's very hard for people that I deal with in the age ranges because it's not pretty. It's not flashy to be able to put, like, I'm doing a base week RP 6 4 snatches and it's only at 65%. Like, that's not cool to show, or it's not like necessarily what people want to see out of weightlifters. But you're laying a foundation for the potential for then that number to be higher when you finally do get back to singles. Um, One of my teammates taught me this, like, kind of a adage or like approach is about like harvesting the crop too early. So if you ever did like a elementary school experiment and you buried a seed for it to grow into a plant, if you keep digging up that seed and looking at the seed and going, is it growing roots? It's never going to grow roots. But you got to leave it in the ground and let it kind of grow roots and expand and grow into a plant before you decide to pull up the seed and see what you got. If you're always ripping up that plant, it's never going to keep growing. And those lifters that I've seen usually always hit the same numbers. It's cool, but when you go to competition for 3 years and you've done the exact same jumps, plus or minus maybe 5 to 6 kilos, it's probably because you're harvesting the seed too much. You gotta wait for it to be ready to be harvested, and that's what I think about doing, like, total days. We don't do, and what I mean by total days is, old school weightlifters follow like the Big Friday model. Friday, we're going to snatch and clean and jerk singles and see what we got. We're going to do that year around, because the more times we come back to it, the more chances we have to then arrive at a new number. And I hate that you just want to magically get there versus taking a long-term perspective, zoom out a little bit. Instead of zooming in, zoom out and look big picture as to what is going to set you up for being the best you when the time is right. I don't care what you snatch and clean and jerk singles when you're 6 months out of competition. If you're snatching, clean and jerking singles 6 months out of competition, hitting PRs, you're harvesting too early. Keep it, dig under the ground and let it grow and see what it can become when it matters on stage for a qualifier for a big meet versus just what you do in the training hall. Nobody cares what you do in the training hall. You can hit PRs left and right in the training hall, but when you get on stage, if you just crap the bed, you're prepping wrong. And I think a lot of people really take the approach as they just want to snatch and clean and jerk because that's the sport, but they don't they don't zoom out. They don't see big picture. And that's kind of my problem with doing total days constantly.
I think that also sets an expectation for athletes when we're going heavy every week. We set the expectation that is the rate of progress you should expect. You should expect to see, because I'm having you test every week. It probably means that I want you to get better every week, right? But I think that sets an improper expectation of how long it takes to actually get good and build a base to lead to longer results. Where, like you were saying, nobody wants to post their set of 4 snatch at RPE 6, but everybody wants to see the heavy single. Well, one's going to lead to something else. The heavy set of 4 is going to lead to a much, especially if you kind of like, I really like to do this with athletes sometimes, where I'll say like, okay, we're gonna be starting this block with triples for 4 weeks, and then we're gonna do doubles for 4 weeks and singles for 4 weeks. Right now, your triple max is, we'll call it 30 kilos off of your single max, whatever it is. If we can get that triple max to be 15 kilos off of your single max, that probably means that your single max is going to go up. But then if we compound that into the next phase where we say your double max is only 10 kilos off of your single, well, what if we can get your double max to match your current single without retesting your single? Well, then when we go to retest, you might actually have a whole lot more in the tank rather than like, yeah, you could, if you just push singles of the week, you might get away with a 1 kilo PR. That's cool. But what if you take a step back and have a longer approach? You might not only get away with that 1 kilo PR, but you might also be able to stack up 5 and 10 and 15 kilos at the end of that cycle.
Yeah, one thing I think weightlifting, a lot of the times, especially when you're looking for programming advice, it's kind of clouded by the high performance level, by the people at the very tip top of the sport and what kind of programs they run and how they organize their training. Because, yeah, when you're competing internationally 4 times a year, your program probably has to prioritize heavy singles more than somebody who doesn't do that. Somebody who is 5 years out, if that, of competing internationally ever. And so I think when you ask high level coaches, a lot of the times, about their opinions on programming, they're skewed a little bit by what works for their top level athletes, and what keeps them in good shape for competing year round, as opposed to potentially what got that athlete to that level, which some coaches will say, this training method, Big Friday, year round is what got them here. But Big Friday, yeah, I think that's the expression of the strength gains. It's not the method of getting them in that way. So that's what I wanted to add to that.
Yeah, and I think the ones that are able to follow that model usually have a really good long base foundation that have gotten them there. And just because, like I said, the model is Big Friday doesn't necessarily mean that you max out snatch and clean and jerk on the Big Friday and try to hit new PRs. You have, take the harvest seed analogy, you set everything up for that week to see what you can do on that Friday and not get frustrated or mad when it doesn't go right, but you've done everything you could based on the parameters of what your season looks like. And then Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday is all to set you up best again for that next Friday. Problem with this model is you have to be very in tune with yourself to do this model, because just because it's the big Friday model does not mean you're going to hit PRs every Friday. It is, you're going to be real with yourself. And honestly, you're even a higher level athlete because you're real with yourself and you understand that not every snatch and clean and jerk total day is going to be the best day of my life. And you're okay with that because, again, you can see big picture. And usually those that do well on that model have many years of not doing that model that has gotten them, whether it's, a different sport or a long-term approach or a volume approach or, even powerlifting or CrossFit background. Like, those are all good foundational things that you have developed, even though it's not weightlifting specific.
If you found this video helpful, then make sure to check out this video here or this episode of the Last Set Best Set podcast.